Good morning, everybody. My name is Wayne Jangs, and I want to personally welcome you to our forum discussion today. Our topic this morning is anti-Semitism. Our Shaker Hearts Unitarian congregation organizes these forums for several reasons: as a congregational service to the community, to support personal reflection, social action, and to encourage individual and collective growth for all of us. Thank you for joining us. I'd like to now introduce the coordinator for today's forum, Jim Rich. He will introduce the topic and our speaker. Jim?
Greetings. I wish we could share this forum with you in person. That's not possible, but we can deliver a good discussion on the many facets of anti-Semitism. A recent survey noted that over the past 5 years, 82% of Jewish Americans said that anti-Semitism has increased. That's compared to 43% of the general US population. Anti-Semitic social media messages and tweets have recently appeared on placards and signs on political protest events with increasing frequency. We're fortunate to have Mark Weber, our forum speaker, to help us understand the history and recent growth of anti-Semitism. Mark is Dean of Libraries Emeritus of Kent State University. He is also president of Cleveland Peace Action. He is on the steering committee of the Cleveland chapter of Jewish Voice for Peace. He is a spiritual leader of the Jewish Secular Committee, and he is a commissioned lay minister of UUCC. Mark visited Palestine in 2017 and has written and spoken extensively on Israel and Palestine. We are pleased to have him speak about today's topic. Mark wishes to state that the views expressed in this presentation are his own and do not necessarily represent those of the organizations with which he is affiliated. Before I turn this over to Mark, I have a few housekeeping notes. At 10, we'll open the discussion up to questions and answers. As you listen to Mark, click on the question and answer button, which is probably at the bottom of your screen. You can type or copy your questions on the Q&A screen and send them to the forum committee members who will organize them for Mark in the Q&A session. Mark, we welcome your comments this morning.
Thanks, Jim. It's an honor and a pleasure for me to be with you this morning, and I want to wish everyone in the audience a happy Valentine's Day. The presentation this morning is about the weaponization of the term anti-Semitism in public discourse. The purpose of this is to silence one particular point of view, and that would be the Palestinian narrative. This presentation was produced about 1 year ago for a social justice conference that was held on the campus of Case Western Reserve University. Unfortunately, the university intervened and removed the presentation from the published program. And instead, it substituted a much different program by the Anti-Defamation League. The Anti-Defamation League and I agree on a few things, but disagree on many. One, I certainly disagree with the ADL's expansive view of what constitutes anti-Semitism. I also disagree with its sponsorship of Israeli training programs for US police departments in crowd control tactics that the police would use to deploy against people of color in our urban centers. And finally, I am disappointed that the ADL continues to support a myriad of anti-BDS laws. BDS stands for boycott, divestiture, and sanctions laws passed in mostly red states in the United States. These laws are, in most cases, clear violations of the First Amendment, and championing them, as the ADL does, is strange behavior for an organization which considers itself a civil rights organization. I also am concerned that the ADL, while it has condemned the family separation policy of the former Trump administration, and kudos to them for that, but at the same time, they offer training programs in Israel for ICE agents so that apparently they can do their jobs more effectively in terms of rounding up undocumented workers. For most of our adult lives, we have grown up in a world dominated by, when it comes to Israel-Palestine, a single story, the tyranny of a single point of view. I am not trying to suppress that point of view. I would simply like to ask for equal time for the Palestinian story. It is long overdue. We will have a Q&A, and I welcome your questions, and I will try to hasten through these formal remarks so that there will be time for questions. And of course, I would like to thank Wayne Jennings for his assistance with the screen sharing, and for the Forum Committee for their courage and bravery in having me give this presentation. So we will begin with the outline. The weaponization of the term anti-Semitism. We will start in the present and then go to the past. In the present, what were the factors that caused us to weaponize anti-Semitism, the term, and use it as a cudgel with which to discourage those who would be critical of Israel's treatment of the Palestinian Arabs? Well, the first one was in 2005, the rise of the BDS movement. BDS stands for Boycott, Divestiture, and Sanctions. The BDS movement began when 170 Palestinian civil society organizations asked for a boycott of Israel until Israel changed its policies on 3 areas: equality, promoting equality for both Arabs and Jews, ending the military occupation of the West Bank, which is illegal, and also providing for the right of return of Palestinian Arabs who are victims of the Nakba, the ethnic cleansing, which took place more than 60 years ago. Second, the demographics in Israel alarmed many in the Israeli establishment, with the exception of ultra-Orthodox birth rates. These officials saw that the Arab birth rate in Israel-Palestine is higher than that of the Jewish birthright, and they feared that eventually Israelis would become a minority. Hence, the birthright movement, which allowed college students from the United States to visit Israel free of charge. The birthright idea is interesting because the theory is, I guess, that Jewish kids growing up in the United States who've never seen Israel somehow have a birthright to go there and to live there. Third, Israel's military occupation of the West Bank increased both in severity and also in the number of casualties for Palestinian Arabs. And a protest began to happen in many places around the world. And finally, the changing of the definition of anti-Semitism from racial hatred of Jews to criticism, to include criticism of the Israeli government's handling of the Palestinian Arabs on the West Bank. So that the broadening of the definition was used as a way to blunt some of these other trends that I just mentioned. The tactics which were used to implement this change, well, of course, the use of the term anti-Semitism to scare critics. When someone is critical of Israel, many times they don't want to be accused of being anti-Semitic simply because they disagree with Israeli policy on this issue or that issue. Second of all, with the support of pro-Israel organizations, 26 states in the United States have passed anti-BDS laws, laws which in some cases criminalize advocacy of BDS, a clear violation of the First Amendment, and in other cases, they penalize companies or nonprofits or GSOs who support BDS. Third, there has been incredible pressure on colleges and universities by Israel advocacy organizations, as well as by wealthy alumni and donors, to get university to pass policies condemning as anti-Semitic Palestinian solidarity activities on campus. And finally, and for many of us who remember the 1950s, it is ironic that we now have the return of the blacklist in the form of something called Canary Mission, which is a project sponsored by Hillel of San Francisco, as well as the Israeli American Institute and its leader, Adam Milstein, to fund what amounts to a blacklist, which lists and sort of Palestinian activists, Jewish activists, and Americans in general who are active in supporting the rights of Palestinians. We have not had blacklists since the 1950s and McCarthyism, but we have it now. We'll move, if we could, Wayne, to a brief history of the hatred of Jews. Sometimes, and sometimes even academics do this, they talk of anti-Semitism as if it is several thousand years old. In fact, the hatred of Jews in much of antiquity was religious-based hatred of Jews, hatred nonetheless, but still not race-based anti-Semitism. Examples of this, of course, the church, the Christian church, especially in the early years of the Common Era, promoted hatred of Jews. There was the Christ killer myth, we're all familiar with that, the notion that Jews were responsible for the murder of Jesus, who, of course, if they were to dig a little deeper, they would know that Jesus himself was a Jew and that he was killed by the Romans. Second, there are the blood libel myths, popular at some times in the Tsarist Russia, which said that during Passover, during Pesach, Jews drank the blood of Christian children. And third, there was the Inquisition and the rise of what are called New Christians. The Inquisition was a project of the Catholic Church, aimed not at Jews, but at Christians who were deemed to be insufficiently pious. Oftentimes, the people who were targets were people who had lands that the church wanted. However, Jews were not covered by the Inquisition, but Jews who had recently converted to Christianity were. And they were frequently persecuted and burned at the stake by the church authorities, because it was argued, while they say they were Christians, underneath they were simply still practicing their Judaism. And if we could move the screen up a little bit, thanks, Wayne. They are called, these new Christians are often called conversos or Marranos. The Crusades began as an effort by some of the Christian nations of Europe, France, and especially France, the German principalities, and England, to seize land, to seize back land in the Holy Land that had been captured by the Saracens or the Muslim Arab armies that overran much of the Middle East. The Crusades were anti-Semitic because on the way, they stopped and raided, pillaged, killed, butchered Jews in Jewish communities in parts of Central and Eastern Europe. But the end game of this hatred of Jews was the conversion of all Jews to Christianity. The next phase of hatred of Jews was the birth of racial hatred of Jews. And here is where the term anti-Semitism first comes into use. The term anti-Semitism does not date from antiquity, as some people would have us believe, but it began in the year 1891. And the advocate of the term anti-Semitism was a man named Wilhelm Friedrich Marr, and you can see his dates. Born in Germany right after one of Germany's, Prussia's wars to help consolidate its territory, and he died in 1904, ironically the same year as Theodor Herzl, one of the architects of practical Zionism. Friedrich Wilhelm Marr began an organization called the League of Anti-Semites. Marr disliked religious persecution of Jews because he considered it to be unscientific. And so he coined the term anti-Semitism to be a sort of pseudo-scholarly, pseudo-scientific way to dress up what is essentially racial hatred of Jews. The League of Anti-Semites promoted the idea that Jews had what they called a racial stain, which could never be removed, no matter how often they converted to Christianity. And Marr said, Jews are not a people and not a religion. We are a race, he said. This attitude, which began in the 1890s, as I said, was consistent with developments in other parts of the world, the Western world. In the United States, if you probably have read about the eugenics movement, which took off and which really, at bottom, was committed to the forced sterilization of people, women, I should say, in order to build a master race. And eugenics was supported in the United States by some prominent Americans, including one president, Theodore Roosevelt, and of course, the founder of the birth control movement, Margaret Sanger. This, at this time, terms like Aryan and Semite were used. There were Aryan languages, which you guessed it would be French, German, the Scandinavian languages, Northern European and Western European, and the Semitic languages, which of course would be Yiddish, Hebrew, to the extent that Hebrew was used much at that point outside of synagogues. The end result of this anti-Semitism was not conversion, it was extinction. And as one writer had said, from the ideas of William Marr and the birth of racial anti-Semitism, it was only a few steps to the Holocaust. The takeaway message that I have here for this, for our gathering this morning, and the gathering that I had hoped to, the presentation I'd hoped to give a year ago to students at Case Western Reserve, is simply this: hatred of Jews, hatred of Muslims, hatred of any other group is wrong. Anti-Semitism is the racial hatred of Jews. Reasoned criticism of the Israeli government's occupation policies on the West Bank is not, and I repeat, is not anti-Semitism. I tried to conclude my remarks a little early so that there would be more time for questions. And at this point, I am happy to take your questions. And thank you very much again for listening.
Thank you, Mark, for your excellent presentation. I know I speak for others when I say we have all learned valuable information about anti-Semitism. It's something we all should know something more about. It's now time for questions and answers. Again, please look for the Q&A button on your screen and type or copy your questions. If your question is chosen, we'll recognize you by your first name unless you hit the anonymous button. While we're talking about computer buttons, I also want to mention the chat box button. If you're not already on our forum list and want to receive an email reminder of future forums, please give us your name and email address in the chat box. I will now turn this over to Laura Impernoni and Cliff Wire, members of our forum committee and co-chairs of our Q&A section. They will choose the questions or comments you've typed or copied with the Q&A button.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you, Mark, for this very informative presentation. It's especially inspiring to me to hear you put down the notion of hatred of any one group of people. So I have a two-part question for you here. First of all, what would you say is the approach of the United States? What has the approach of the United States been in the last 10 or 15 years toward Middle East, Israeli, Palestine relationships? And do you feel that it's open-minded at all? Or what would you say is the current situation we find ourselves in?
Well, U.S. policy toward the Middle East, and especially U.S. policy on the Israel-Palestine issue, has been solidly pro-Israel. Israel gets at least $4 billion a year. That's $10 million a day in military aid from the United States with no strings attached. U.S. military aid to the Palestinian, first of all, there's no U.S. military aid to the Palestinian Authority. There is some aid that comes through a UN refugee organization. And the United States has given money for selected projects, but the US sides with Israel on every single question without fail. The notion that the US policy is even-handed is, with respect to all those who believe this, is a myth.
And this is a follow-up question. I'll ask it, and then Cliff Larr will ask the next question. As best you can tell so far, do you think there will be any change in U.S. policy with the new Biden administration?
No, I don't. Fundamentally, it will be the same. It will not be as, not be quite as anti-Palestinian as the Trump administration, because in that area, the Trump administration broke new ground. But it will still be overwhelmingly pro-Israel. And I don't see that changing much, nor will the United States say to Israel that some of us would like it to say, look, we need to reconsider our aid if you don't do something regarding the military occupation on the West Bank. That sort of no rights, no aid approach, which I think is appropriate, I doubt very much. I'd be willing to bet my mortgage on the fact that the United States under the Biden administration and the new Secretary of State the Biden administration will not go there.
Thank you so much. And before turning the next question over to Cliff, I want to encourage everybody. This is such a great opportunity to ask questions of Mark and take advantage of his expertise. So I want to encourage you to look for the Q&A button once more. If you have a PC, it's probably at the bottom of the screen. If you're working with an iPad or iPhone, it could be in other areas, but look for that and ask some questions. And Cliff.
Mark, based on your knowledge, can you explain the basic relationship between Judaism and Zionism, or the difference, if there is one?
Well, Judaism, of course, is a religion that goes back thousands of years. It's one of the three great Abrahamic religions, along with Christianity and Islam.
The oldest.
Zion, yes, the oldest. Thanks, Jim. The Zionism is something different. Some people have said, well, Zionism is simply the 1,000-year-old Jewish longing to return to Palestine. Zionism began in the late 19th century. It began in part because Theodor Herzl believed, and after watching the Dreyfus affair, where a Jewish officer in the French army was accused of treason, and basically he was accused of a treason because he was Jewish. That would be Alfred Dreyfus. And he saw the hostility that the crowd directed toward Dreyfus. And he said, if we see that in France, the country of the French Revolution and Enlightenment, then Jews are not safe anywhere and must have a country of our own, their own, our own. And that really began the move toward a Zionism, or was the birth of Zionism and the move toward a search for a Jewish territory. And there were several areas under consideration, including South America, Uganda, and of course, historic Palestine. Historic Palestine was chosen. Zionism at that time, and throughout much of its history, until the rise of religious Zionism much later, Zionism was really anti-religious and rejected the idea of the European ghetto Jew. They wanted a new Jewish citizen who would be strong, who would work the land, and who would be able to defend themselves, like Jews were unable to do in Europe when faced with many pogroms, and of course during the Holocaust. The problem is, of course, that with Zionism, it said that Jews need their own territory. And when Herzl looked at Palestine, he said Palestine is a land for Jews. It is a land without people, for a people without land. There must have been something wrong with Herzl's eyesight, because there were already indigenous people, almost 1 million of them living in Palestine, and they were there. And so, as the saying goes, the story, The Bride of Palestine, and the colonists say, well, we want the Bride of Palestine. And someone says to them, I'm sorry, but she's married to another man. In other words, I'm sorry, but there are people already living there. Zionism from the beginning was about the displacement of Palestinian Arabs and taking them off the land. Zionism really, I would argue, has nothing to do with the core values of religious Judaism. It is a secular adaptation, and its goal is simply the creation of a Jewish state. Now, Herzl said a state for Jews, but that was simply later changed to a Jewish state, which means a state that is run in part by Jewish law, which is called halakha. So Zionism and Judaism are fundamentally different. Zionism is very modern, and Judaism is as Jim mentioned, is an ancient religion. They have come together, and is as such, I would argue, Zionism has changed Judaism, and not for the better.
There are a couple of very interesting questions from our audience. Cheryl asked, when you speak of racial hatred of Jews, what about Jewish people of color? How does this fit into the picture?
Jewish people of color, if we're talking about Jewish people of color who have made aliyah, that means who have left their homes in the diaspora and moved to Israel, Ethiopian Jews, the Falashas, and even Jews from Arab lands, Morocco, they have faced significant discrimination in Israel by the Ashkenazi elite, most of whom come from Eastern and Central Europe, like Ben Gurion came from Russia, Chaim Weizmann from Poland, these Zionist leaders. Herzl came from Hungary. So they saw that these Jews who were from Arab lands had different customs and were different from them other than their belief in Judaism. And so they were discriminated against by the Ashkenazi elite in employment, in housing, in education. And I think when I was in Israel, in Palestine, I had the honor of meeting a man named Reuben Aspergel, man then in his 80s. He was the leader of an organization called the Israeli Black Panthers, which was inspired by the Black Panthers in the United States, but in a way much different. It was the voice of the Middle Eastern Mizrahi Jews who were demanding equal rights in Israel and were being resisted by the Israeli establishment. And I think that Golda Meir, when she was prime minister, especially had harsh words for the Mizrahi Jews, the Jews of color. Anyway, so that's at least part of the story.
And in the United States, as well as I hear, Jewish people of color migrating to the United States and trying to become associated with Jewish culture here in general. Has that been a difficulty as well?
Well, the United States, of course, has had its own anti-Semitic history regarding Jews. The best example is the Leo Frank case in Georgia in 1915, when Leo Frank, the Jewish supervisor in a pencil factory in Atlanta, was accused of raping and murdering a young factory worker, a white woman named Mary Fagan. And a mob took Leo Frank and lynched him. And that case still is talked about and written about. So that's one example. However, Jews of color, if in the United States, were likely treated as other Americans of color and discriminated against. And while anti-Semitism in the United States has been a significant issue, it is not on the same level as the racial oppression suffered by people of color in general in the United States?
Brian says, please say more about military training program for the United States police officers in Israel. And he says, I don't think most people know about that.
Well, before beginning, my colleague in Jewish Voice for Peace in Cleveland, Eric Resnick, has done most of the work on this, this project, which involves, and it's Jewish Voice for Peace calls it the deadly exchange. But even if you don't want to use that term, police departments, including the Cleveland Police Department, have sent officers or policemen, police officers to Israel for training. One of the advantages that the military occupation of the West Bank has provided to the Israelis is the opportunity to test out new methods of surveillance, crowd control, and other anti-personnel sort of tactics on the Palestinians, and then train police officers in those same tactics to be used in the United States. So police departments in a number of large urban centers have sent officers to Israel for this kind of training. And contrary to many critics, it is not anti-Semitic to bring this point up. It is simply a fact, and it exists. And the Israel also trains ICE agents in some of the tactics that are used to implement the family separation policy that was pursued by the recently departed Trump administration. So this is an ongoing practice, an ongoing policy, an ongoing program, and it continues. And again, I'm not an expert on this like Eric is, but I do know enough to say that when you look at the total number of metropolitan police departments that participate, it is, to me at least, shocking.
Okay. Mark, Supreme Court Associate Justice Louis Brandeis, his comment, in the formation of, what role did he play in the formation and development of the Israeli state? According to the Jewish Virtual Library, it was Brandeis who coined the term that to be a good American meant that local Jews should be Zionists.
Louis Brandeis, if he wants to, I know that he is regarded as one of our most eloquent Supreme Court justices. I would say a couple things about Louis Brandeis, one of which was he was a big supporter of eugenics. Two, for a Supreme Court justice to say that while he is sitting on the bench is, I think, inappropriate and a violation of his oath of office. If that is how he feels, how could he possibly rule on a case involving Semitism, Zionism, since he himself says that is the duty of all Jews to be Zionist? He has no right to say that. American Jews can make up their own minds as to whether what their attitude will be toward a Jewish state, and they don't need to be told that by an eminent jurist like Louis Brandeis, with all due respect to the memory of Louis Brandeis.
I have another question from Nina. How pervasive is racial hatred of Palestinians by Israelis?
Like an epidemic. Like an epidemic. You can see it. When I visited Palestine, with the exception of a quick trip to Tel Aviv, we spent most of our time in Arab East Jerusalem and in a number of Palestinian cities like Ramallah and Hebron and others, Jenin. The attitude of the occupying forces, the Israeli army, and their dislike of Palestinians is palpable. And you can see it in everyday life. I have seen examples of the Israeli Defense Force supporting settlers, Israeli settlers, as they attack Palestinian farmers, throwing rocks at them and trying to burn their olive fields. The Israeli army does not intervene to stop the violence. They are there to protect the settlers who are promoting the violence. So the attitude of most Israelis, it's hard for me to say most, almost every Israeli that I came in contact with, unless he or she was part of the Palestinian Solidarity Movement, their attitude toward Palestinian Arabs was one of contempt.
Ken asked, rather than a two-state solution, what about a confederacy as a possibility in Israel for a peaceful solution?
Well, that's an interesting question. So there were a number of early Zionists. I've forgotten his name, the eminent Jewish philosopher, I can't think of his name. He lived in Israel, Gershom Scholem and others. They advocated a confederation, a Jewish home, but not a Jewish state. It would be a binational state where Jews and Arabs, and presumably others, would live together and learn to live together. But that was never really the goal of the Zionist movement. Right from the beginning in Palestine, their focus was solely on the advancement of Jewish control of as much land as possible. The Israeli Labor Party, which liked then to think of itself as a socialist party, promoted the idea that there would be a Jewish confederation or federation of labor that would organize only Jewish workers, but would not organize Palestinian workers. Anyone who is familiar with trade unionism knows that you organize all the workers, not just some of them. But that was an early indication that this was never going to be about living together. This was going to be about Jewish control of the land and the Arabs trying to make whatever accommodation they could to their new masters. And that really is what has come about. Let me just mention, because I think it's instructive, Nelson Mandela, when he emerged from prison on Robben Island in 1991, he was approached by apartheid whites who said, "We want our own white republic and that you, South African blacks, can have the rest. Some South African blacks who were to the left of Mandela said, we want our own black republic. Mandela said, the land of South Africa belongs to all the people who live there, regardless of whether they are black or white. That is how I see the land between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. It belongs to all the people who live there, not just some of them. And so I think a truly secular binational state with religious rights for all is the best way to address the issues that confront us now. Otherwise, there will be endless wrangling over how big should the Palestinian state be. And the Israeli point of view is, well, as small as possible. And where would the border be between Israel and Palestine? How do you figure that out? Where would it be? Is it the green line from 1948, the armistice line, or is it another line? When you say that the entire area of historic Palestine should be one state and all the people who live in its borders above the age of 18 are eligible to vote, it becomes then not a national question, it becomes a civil rights question. It becomes a question of citizenship. And that is the approach that I think is the best, although of course my many critics say that it is utopian. But that would be my response to that very good question.
I have a question for you. Growing up in Southern towns and Southern churches, I'll say that the general attitude toward Judaism at that time was not favorable. And then I would say that's like putting it mildly in some places. There were not very many Jewish people either in those locations. So it's been really interesting to see evangelical Christians and other mainstream churches in the United States all of a sudden in the last few years embrace Judaism and even Zionism. So I'm wondering, how do Jewish people who are culturally Jewish feel about that? Does it affect United States policy at all?
Yes, it does. There are a number of books, and I can't remember her name, but the title of the book, The Longest Days Were Sundays, is about the experience of a Jewish woman growing up in the Deep South. We're talking about the old Confederacy, not North Carolina or, Virginia. Well, Virginia was the old Confederacy, but I mean Mississippi, Alabama, though she grew up there. And it was her memory. And certainly there was anti-Semitism on the part of Christians toward Jews. One of the most important things, I think, that Jews did, Jack Rothschild, who was the rabbi of the congregation in Atlanta. If you remember watching the movie Driving Miss Daisy, in that movie, Miss Daisy, played by Jessica Tandy, is Jewish. And they talk about a synagogue being burned down or being firebombed. That was Jack Rothschild's synagogue. And he was attacked and threatened because of his outspoken support for Martin Luther King and for civil rights. The owner of Rich's department store in Atlanta was Jewish. And at some point, the owner of the department store simply said, we are now hiring the best qualified people regardless of race, which meant that African Americans, and especially young women who are looking for jobs in sales in the department store, were able to get hired. Now, segregation of lunch counters continued, but there were examples of Southern Jews who stood out and reached out to African Americans in these ways. When we talk about what is called evangelical Christianity, not all evangelical Christians are this way. Some evangelical Christians are not Zionist, but the Christians United for Israel, CUFI, C-U-F-I, is the best example of Christian Zionism. It promotes and supports Israel because these evangelicals believe that at the end of days, Jesus will return and all of the Jews will then convert to Christianity and everything will be nice. So basically, Christian Zionism is a form of anti-Semitism because it instrumentalizes Jews as simply a way by which the Christian myth of the return of the Messiah will be recognized. In the end, Jews, of course, cease to be Jews. So it is important to realize that these Christian Zionists, like Robert Jeffries, who is really anti-Semitic, but also a Christian Zionist, these people are very, very important to the Netanyahu government because they are more supportive of Israel's policies in the West Bank than are the American Jewish population in general. So the evangelical Christians are a key part, both in terms of votes and also in terms of money, of the Israel lobby.
It's very interesting. Thank you. I had not heard some of that before. So Cliff, do you have a question or two?
Yes, Nina brings up, you've only mentioned Palestinian Arabs. What about Palestinian Christians? Where do they fall into this?
Well, Palestinian Arabs include both Muslims and Christians. Whether they are Muslim or Christian, they're Arabs. So Palestinian Arabs, both Christians and Muslims, suffer under the occupation. If they happen to live within the boundaries of 1948 Israel, they have citizenship and are allowed the right to vote. And many or most of them vote for the United Arab List, which has about between 12 and 15 seats in the Knesset, but of course is shunned by all of the Zionist parties, whether those parties are on the right, which is most of them, or a few of them which are on what passes for the left in Israel. Most Palestinian Arabs are Muslim, but there is a small minority, a Christian minority, community around Beit Sahur, for example, in other places. And both Christians and Muslim Arabs are united in their support of BDS and the desire for an end of the occupation.
Okay. We have another question from Eileen. Do you think campaign finance reform would temper the influence of the Israeli lobby in equating criticism of Israel Zionism as anti-Semitism? If not, what could temper that power?
I don't think that's an interesting point. Or campaign finance reform, you mean like repeal of Citizens United, that sort of thing?
Possibly, yes, because our
It may
politicians
have-
are affected by money.
It may have a little effect. I mean, because it might put some restrictions on extreme right-wing Zionist donors like I'm drawing a blank as a senior moment. The man from help me with his name, from Las Vegas, who is a big
Sheldon Adelson?
Pardon?
Not Sheldon Adelson.
Yes, Sheldon Adelson. Thank you.
Okay.
You know, he wouldn't be able to give simply as much money as he wanted, and the donations would have to be tracked more than they are now, which is right now it's just open season. But I think what is more effective, really, is for people to understand and to support the right of Americans, American citizens, to be able to believe what they want regarding Israel, whether they support what Israel is doing on the West Bank or whether they oppose it, without being labeled as anti-Semitic. That is really, and then people seek to pass laws restricting their right to criticize Israel. In one state, in order to get a state job, you have to take what amounts to a loyalty oath, saying that you have not engaged in any activity critical or harmful to Israel. There is no requirement regarding the United States, because all those laws have been struck down. But these kind of things exist. And I believe all I ask for, really, is a level playing field where the Palestinian narrative can be given equal time with the Israeli narrative, and American citizens can make up their own minds.
Jim asked, how would you characterize the effect of the movement of the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem?
In terms of symbolism, it was done by the Trump administration in order to shore up support among the evangelical Christian base in the United States. That's why the Trump administration departed from decades-long policy of the United States in not recognizing Jerusalem. My own view is it is symbolic. It's a slap in the face to Palestinians. But what else is new? Slaps in the face of Palestinians are de rigueur and happen all the time. What's more important than the moving of the embassy is the fact that US policy continues to essentially give unstinted, uncritical support to Israel in almost everything it does regarding the West Bank. Yes, occasionally the Obama administration made noises about not liking certain things, but in the end, the Israeli government was able to get whatever it wanted, and it continues to be able to do so. And many Congress people, especially Democrats, realize that if they criticize it, they do so at their peril. As Congresswoman Ilhan Omar found out, that she was quickly branded as being anti-Semitic, but because she made comments about the influence of the Israel lobby in the United States. So I think that the Israel lobby has suffered a few setbacks recently, but it is still very much of an influence in Congress, so much so that congressmen, because several have told me this, they've said, look, I know what Israel is doing in the West Bank is wrong. But if I stand up and challenge it, I'll get a primary opponent. So, well,
We hear that a lot, don't we?
yeah.
About a number of issues. So we're coming just about to the end of our time with questions and answers. And I'm wondering, Cliff, if you have another question here.
Here's a quick one. Has Ohio passed a BDS law?
They've passed a couple of things, one of which is House Bill 476, which was supported by the ADL, all of the Israel lobby, and including one of its big supporters was former Congressman Eric Fingerhut. Some may remember him, who became the CEO of Hillel International. But so that 476 prevents NGOs, nonprofits, and companies from doing business with the state of Ohio if they have in any way cooperated with a boycott of Israel. And then there is another sort of resolution passed by the General Assembly taking to task university administrations if they don't crack down on Palestinian activists on campuses, especially campuses like Oberlin and other places. Of course, Oberlin is a private institution, but public institutions as well, Ohio State, Kent State, Bowling Green. So there are at least 2 anti-BDS statutes on the book that were passed. Neither one has been challenged in court, and so they continue to stand.
Thank you so much for very intelligent questions from a number of people, and for giving us a little bit more information during the question and answer time. I think we'll turn it back over to Jim for some final words.
I want to thank Mark for an excellent forum on anti-Semitism, which is a frequently misunderstood and important topic. We truly appreciate his expertise and commitment to being here with us this morning. Some upcoming announcements. Next Sunday's 9:30 forum is titled Living with COVID-19, What's Next Medically? Approximately 1 out of every 17 people in the US has had COVID-19. Estimates vary on the number of people who have been vaccinated. Approximately 80% of the population must be immune before normal lifestyles can return. When might this happen? Good question. That's just one of the questions we'll be discussing next week. Our speaker is Dr. Johnny Rose, MD and PhD, Assistant Professor at the CWRU Center for Community Health Integration and Program Director, UH Preventive Medicine. Today's forum will be recorded, will soon be available on our Unitarian website, ucleveland.org. That's ucleveland.org. Look for the recording starting tomorrow in the large forum square on the website. I also want to mention the chat box button. If you are not already on our forum list and want to receive an email reminder of future forums, please give us your name and email address in the chat box button on your screen. Finally, we want to invite all of you to our virtual Unitarian service at 11 o'clock. This week, we celebrate in words and song the seventh Unitarian Universalist principle, which is respect for the interdependent web of all of existence of which we are a part, acceptance of one another, and encouragement of spiritual growth. The service will be conducted via YouTube. To participate, go to uucleveland.org. Again, that's uucleveland.org. Click on the green box in the upper right-hand side of the website. The YouTube link will take you directly to the 11 o'clock service. Thank you for joining us today. We appreciate your support and look forward to seeing you next Sunday at 9:30. Again, thanks.